Today is Friday, February 5th, 2021, and you are listening to the 58th broadcast of TBR Radio Presents the TBR History Hour. Our guest today is Dr. Edward Mike. Dr. Edward Mike is the author of the book Salvaging Civilization, and we'll be talking today about that great book. That great book, by the way, is available in the Barnes Review and American Free Press bookstores, available at www.barnesreview.org and at the American Free Press website as well. So, Dr. Mike, welcome to TBR Radio Presents the TBR History Hour.
Thank you.
Before we get into the book itself and a few questions that I wanted to ask you about some things that struck me as interesting in the book, just tell us just a little bit about yourself. I know you mentioned this in the book. You talked about how you had entered into the priesthood as a young man, and then kind of how you had left the priesthood, how you had studied not just at a normal seminary, but you had studied at a seminary that was there at the Vatican, and you kind of got to see the inner workings of the Vatican, and then from there you left the priesthood and you became a psychiatrist, and just kind of let our readers know who you are so they'll have an idea of what brought you to write a book as weighty as the one that you've written.
Well, first of all, let me say that I'm a psychologist, not a psychiatrist. Yes, I had a pretty good start as a young man. I had a lot of recognition, but I wanted to save the world and support the Christian message, and so I entered the seminary and found myself in a rather elite group over in Rome, actually technically living in the Vatican itself for 4 years, and studying at a university in Rome, the Gregorian University, which is really world famous. I counted 23 different nationalities that also were there. Our common language was Latin, and that was a wonderful experience. These were the top people in the world and very impressive theologians. But yes, my experience with the Vatican was something that really soured me and actually almost destroyed my life. I found that the Vatican was just a very corrupt enterprise and had very little to do with the Christian values that I wanted to champion throughout my lifetime. And so we endured it. We banded together, and actually I devoted a considerable amount of my time trying to keep my fellow seminarians from killing themselves. It was that serious. But we got through it, and I came back to the United States and became quite well recognized as a counselor in my first assignment. Even the doctors and the attorneys were referring a lot of their clients to me, and so that was a feather in my cap. In the summers, I worked with the Mexican migrant farm workers. They were illegal farm workers, but they spoke Spanish, and I was fluent in Spanish. So in the summer, I worked with them in northern Michigan. They picked the cherries and other crops, and I was saying mass in barns, and I was the court translator. But to cut to the quick, I clashed more and more with official religion. I was in the middle of a lot of things. I had a large what was called an underground church, and I was teaching a class at the high school. And the bishop called me up and said, "Well, three priests, assistant priests, in a row had attempted suicide in northern Michigan in a parish there, and would I please take their place?" And so I did, and that was really a turning point for me. I began teaching a course in Scripture, and with a few people in the first class, I soon had a great number of parishioners that were coming, and so the pastor canceled the class. And that's just one example of the kind of stuff that I couldn't tolerate anymore. So I felt I had to move on. And so what to do? I mean, I wasn't going to teach Greek or Hebrew. was so well recognized as a counselor that I went and got a PhD in clinical psychology. And then I became quite well known. People were coming from even long distances. One person even flew in from New Jersey who had heard about me. But lately, more recently, there was a parish in northern Michigan that needed, or not a parish, excuse me, there was a hospital in northern Michigan that needed a neuropsychologist. So I brushed that off and served there for the last 12 years or so. Again, I became very well recognized, and doctors from even 75 miles away were sending their patients to me for neuropsychological assessments. But I retired now, and I spent a year working on this book. I think maybe I'm still trying to save the world.
Well, obviously you see problems in the world, or you wouldn't have written a book with a title like Salvaging Civilization. But it seems like you can't even turn on the news these days. The accusation is racism. Everybody's a racist. In your book, you had basically, taken exception to the fact that there's the call for reparations right now, the fact that everybody's being called a racist, the fact that everything literally in our world today has to somehow or another be linked to slavery. And you take exception to that.
Yes, I do. And, as a psychologist, I want facts. I don't want hearsay. I want facts. And so I was able to find a real good source about what life was really like in primitive Africa. This was two missionaries, husband and wife missionaries, that were about the first people who had a written language to penetrate that dark continent at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, that was after our Emancipation Proclamation, but obviously primitive Africa was not less primitive then than it would have been 100 years or 200 years before. And so I have all the facts on what life was like in primitive Africa. For one thing, the people were always on the verge of starvation, and many times they starved to death. There was constant fighting among the different tribes, throwing spears at each other. The missionary said, what was the point of sewing up a spear wound when the person came back the next week with a fresh one? This was what was going on all over the place. They were capturing wives and children primarily from other tribes and selling them to the Arab slave traders. And of course, this again was 40 years after our Emancipation Proclamation, or enslaving them themselves. They were prey to leopards and lions and also cannibals, always in jeopardy for their lives. The witch doctors treated them badly. They mutilated them. They had this practice of using a cow's horn and poking through the ear of a person who they thought had a bad evil demon, and drawing out blood in order to take the evil demon out of the person's head, and oftentimes they killed them that way. It was a common practice for a husband to beat his wife to death, and no one batted an eye about it. Infant mortality was sometimes 90%, and the witch doctor said if you had twins, that these were the work of the devil, and so they threw them out in the jungle to die with a simple statement, 2 dogs were born to you, and that was the end of the story. In fact, in some cases, if the chieftain died, his wives had to be buried alive with him. So, these are just some of the horror stories of what life was like in primitive Africa. So then we look at what happened when these slaves were brought to America. They had comfortable, safe living quarters. They had plenty of good food. They had opportunities for recreation. They could even visit other plantations. They had the best medical care available, and they were introduced to a Christian way of life. What I did was look at the words of the slaves themselves, and no one seemed to bother to do that, but there are at least 3,500 autobiographical accounts of the slaves themselves, and there are books on this in print from all the different slave states. In fact, in the Library of Congress, you can find more of them. So I haven't read every one of them, but I've read a great many of them. And what they say is something you won't find in the evening news. There was abuse. Usually it was the caretakers rather, who were abusive. The owners of the slaves almost never abused their slaves. The slaves, almost all of them, a great majority of them, loved their slave masters, and the masters loved them. And what came out in these stories is that the vast majority of the slaves preferred their slavery to emancipation. And this is understandable because everything was given to them. Everything was provided for them in their role as slaves. But as free men, they had no clue how to operate in a free enterprise society, and so they floundered. And what was also interesting in these autobiographies is that the slaves themselves were just as critical of the post-emancipation blacks as the white people were. They called them lazy and indolent, and were very, very outspoken in their criticism of this new generation. It wasn't their fault. They were dumped into a society that they had no idea how to function in. So of course they floundered, and that's where the problems with race were really exacerbated, because the society in the South had been destroyed. Many of their men were killed in the war, and so they resented the blacks. The whites resented the blacks tremendously and blamed them, scapegoated them for what had happened. And this is where segregation really took off. This is where the Democrats came up with their Ku Klux Klan and so on. And so the horrors really became evident after the Civil War. But the point that I wanted to make and stress is that the majority of these slaves were very, very happy with their slavery and appreciated and loved their masters and didn't want to actually be emancipated. You won't hear that on the evening news.
Well, I want to ask you a couple of follow-up questions, but before we do that, let's have a brief word from our sponsor, the Barnes Review magazine.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
All right, we're back, and our guest today is Dr. Edward Mike, author of the book Salvaging Civilization. Before the break there, Dr. Mike, we were talking about racism and reparations and what it was like for black people to live in Africa. I want to kind of ask you a follow-up question to that, and that is because as I was reading your book, I couldn't quite tell if you were in favor of or if you were in opposition to miscegenation, race mixing, call it what you will. So I'd rather than me trying to assign a position to you, I'll just go ahead and let you speak to that matter yourself.
Again, this is my view. Other people will have different views. There's a gentleman called Bob Woodson who was black. He and I were both very involved in the civil rights era, and he and I both became pretty disillusioned about that effort, because whereas black families had been very intact up until that point, now you find that at least 75% have fatherless households, because now the women are married to the government money and they don't need to have a man around to provide for them. There is an awful lot of to talk, as you mentioned, about reparations and special treatment for blacks. And I find that to be very very destructive, actually, rather than constructive. It says to blacks that they're inferior and that they can't really compete on a level playing field with whites. And that's stupid. We're all created equal, and we all can handle our lives equally. The time of this maltreatment of blacks is past us. But as far as your question goes, I, as a psychologist, am not interested in the race, the nationality of a person. When I lived in Europe, I got to know people from all the different European countries, and stereotypically they all have their characteristics. The Italians and the Spanish and the French and the Germans and English and so on, they all are somewhat unique, although in each case there are also people that seem to be kind of universal people. They're people of the world, and they fit in equally well wherever they are. And so what I look for is not the nationality of a person. I look for what is inside the person as a psychologist. And to give you an example, I have a good friend who worked with me when I was working with the migrant farm workers. He was in Georgia at that time. He was running a program for the equivalent of the Peace Corps in the United States. He was living with a black gal, and he was a conscientious objector. So we had a trial for him, and I and a friend went down for the trial, and he was found not guilty. So we went to the courthouse, and he applied for what I believe is the first black-white marriage license in Atlanta, Georgia. And my friend and I were kind of pretending to be FBI there. It went flawlessly, but the poor woman was crying as she typed out the marriage license. So that's my view. Lily was a human being, and she was a great person. And whether she was black or white was irrelevant to me, because she was a real human being, and she was very a quality gal, and this is the way it is. I've been involved in this for many years, and it's degrading for people to think of reparations. For one thing, there's almost no one who is totally black, or for that matter, totally white. Research showed that the Ku Klux Klanners, almost all of them had some black blood in them. Isn't that ironic? So, what do we do with mixed white blacks? We give them 3/5 of their of what we think is owed them. That's ridiculous. So yes, as far as whites and blacks getting together. In fact, there was a small community in Southwest Michigan. It's called Covert, and they always had integration. The whites and blacks interacted with each other, intermarried. The children all went to school together. Blacks held supervisory positions in the workforce. They proved very well that this works. Unfortunately, they weren't able to convert the rest of society. So that's my view. I think that we're coming to an age now where all of this business about segregation is past history. We have to put it behind us and make it past history, and we have to move on now and look at what's inside people and not what's outside them.
You talk about past history. World War II is past history. It was 70-some years ago. And yet there are still so many who, if you question the official narrative of something that happened 70 years ago, and anybody who they could possibly be protecting is already dead, but still you question the narrative, especially in places like Europe, you go to prison. So it seemed like in your book you had brought up World War II briefly. You had made some references to the Nazis, to the Jews, and I wasn't quite for sure which side you were taking on that, but I got the impression that you were implicating Pope Pius in the Holocaust.
No, I'm so old. I actually was in Rome when Pope Pius XII died. And I spent some time trying to research these stories. Who knows for sure? I wasn't there. I never talked to the Pope. But my impression from what I learned was that he was quite the opposite, that he was one of the good guys, that he smuggled a lot of Jews out of Germany to safety. And he always opposed Hitler. So I think he got a bad rap. But that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of popes that I would find a lot to criticize about.
And so what's the difference, say, between, because basically the last 70 years, globally speaking, has been a big reparation scheme because the Jews have to be compensated for the Holocaust. And so what's the difference between the Jews wanting reparations for the Holocaust and black people wanting reparations for slavery, or is there no difference?
Well, I don't think there's really a difference. I mean, there are a lot of Jews escaped from Germany with the shirts on their back. People who were professors in universities, who had large corporations, who were very influential even and well established in Germany, and they ended up being janitors here in the United States. But they were happy for that because it gave them freedom. And many of them have gone on now to reestablish themselves. And so I think that reparations for dead people seem to be really inappropriate. We have to move on. We have to respect, as I said, all of us are created equal. And I think we have to move on now. I don't want to ignore the Holocaust, and there are some people who would try to ignore it, and that's ridiculous. A friend of mine and I were in Switzerland, and we watched a movie one afternoon, called Mein Kampf, and it was made by the Germans themselves about the horrors of Hitler's regime. And they did such an outstanding job clarifying how awful this situation was in Europe that, my friend and I had planned to go out for dinner afterwards, and neither one of us could eat. We just went to bed. It was that horrible. So the Germans themselves were very ashamed, but they were taken off guard. And this is a message for all of us. There's a video out, and there's written accounts by someone named Kitty Worthman, and she was in Austria, and she pointed out that Austria was in a deep depression, and they heard that Germany to the north was just wonderful. Everybody was employed, and everything was great, and so the Austrians voted 98% for Hitler to take over Austria. And then she depicts how it went from that point on. And I'll tell you, it's kind of a mirror of what we're seeing in the United States. And so, what happened in Europe was terrible. And look what happened. We rallied together. The greatest generation pulled together to fight this attack on our civilization. There was rationing, gas and sugar and so on. We didn't care because we were fighting the attacks, this Nazi socialist attack on civilization itself. And we all pulled together and made it happen. And now, I'm afraid on our watch, we're slipping back into the same situation that caused that catastrophe in Europe. And we have to try our best to avoid it.
Well, one thing that you've said again and again in answer to the last few questions that I've asked you is that we're all created equal. And of course, the man who popularized that statement was Thomas Jefferson when he wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. It seems of all the founding fathers of the United States that Jefferson is coming under perhaps the greatest of attack. They're tearing down his monuments. They're tearing down his memorials. They're stripping his names from buildings. They're taking his portraits down. And the reason for that is because Jefferson was one of those evil slaveholders. And again, everything in America has to come back to racism and slavery. And you mentioned Jefferson in your book as well, but do we really need to rewrite our history and our Constitution and tear down our monuments and, villainize men like Thomas Jefferson? Because, if it weren't for Jefferson, how do I say this? If it weren't for Jefferson, would the liberals even know what to be protesting against right now?
Well, you make a very good point. Let me talk about Jefferson a little bit. For one thing, he was one of the most brilliant and well-educated people ever to walk on this planet Earth. By the time he was 12, he was fluent in Latin and Greek and French, as well as, of course, English. He studied with the best people at the time. He even learned the Teutonic Anglo-Saxon language because he thought they had something to teach him about liberty and freedom. And one of his accomplishments that he was most proud of was establishing the University of Virginia. And he even established there a course in Anglo-Saxon language because he wanted everyone to learn what he had learned about freedom and liberty. Thomas Jefferson was the first person really to make slavery a problem when he said all men are created equal. Most people perhaps don't realize this, but slavery is still legal in many countries around the world, including in the Philippines. It certainly was practiced in primitive Africa when the missionaries got there. And when they first were traveling to where they started working with people, they came across many lined up slaves trailing behind their Arab slaveholders on their mules. That was the first vision of Africa that they had. But Abraham Lincoln is often credited with freeing the slaves, but Abraham Lincoln stood on the shoulders of Thomas Jefferson. In his Gettysburg Address, he said, "Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." Well, where did he get that? He got that from Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson banned the importation of slaves into Virginia. And the irony is that he came within one vote of our not having to have a civil war. He wanted a law that would prohibit expanding slavery into the Western territories. And if you read the Republican National Committee tenets at the time of Abraham Lincoln, that was the thing that they couldn't tolerate. Lincoln would have tolerated slavery in the original slave states, but they could not allow its expansion. And that is actually what triggered the Civil War, along with some economic issues, which I won't get into here. If that vote had passed, then there wouldn't have been a Civil War. We know from history that Thomas Jefferson was very solicitous for the welfare of his slaves. But he realized that you couldn't just dump these slaves into a free enterprise society when they had no preparation for it. And so even though he wasn't really making a lot of money on his slaves, he didn't want to just simply throw them to the wolves. He was very careful, for example, to keep families together. He bought and sold slaves so that he could keep the families intact. So there was always 3 generations of slaves living on his plantation. And so, when we look at it in the light of history and in the light of facts, we find that Thomas Jefferson and the Founding Fathers were the heroes of slavery, certainly not villains. They did what they could at that time. That was a different time from our time, and we have to put things in the context of their time, and that's really a theme of my book, is to be able to focus things on the exact time and events when they occurred so we can really understand what really happened.
So we're going to break for a commercial from our friends over at the American Free Press, and when we come back, I'll have some more questions for our guest, Dr. Edward Mike, author of the book Salvaging Civilization, available at www.barnesreview.org.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
All right, we're back with our guest, Dr. Edward Mike, author of the book Salvaging Civilization, available at www.barnesreview.org. Dr. Mike, communism, it seems, is growing around the world. And so you talk about Karl Marx in your book and the beginning of Marxism, communism, if you will. And so tell us exactly who Karl Marx was and what effect have communist ideas had here in the United States.
Well, thank you. That's a big question, and we could write a book about Karl Marx. He was a very bright guy. He was the son of Jewish German scholars. But if you learn about Karl Marx, the more you learn about him, the more you realize what a selfish and dysfunctional and psychopathic kind of person he was. Karl Marx never bothered to earn 1 penny at a job in his life. He was supported first by his rich relatives, but he was thrown out of Germany, he was thrown out of France, he was thrown out of Belgium. He finally ended up in the London slums. He couldn't pay the rent. They were always threatening to repossess his possession, take away his possessions in order to pay his rent.
So what you're saying then is that Marxism didn't even work for Marx.
Well, it certainly didn't work for Marx. He tried to get, he used the word socialism as a euphemism for communism for the most part, but he tried to get socialism going in Europe, and he never was able to succeed because as soon as someone would show some leadership ability, he would lie about him, cut him down, ruin his reputation, and drive him out of the organization. So he never got anywhere. 2 of his children died of malnutrition. 2 others committed suicide. In our day and age, the Department of Social Services would have taken these children out of their home and put them in foster homes. It didn't work back then. But he died in a chair. 6 people attended his funeral, Engels being one of them. He was not at all popular. He was despised, actually, by most everyone in his day.
And so tell us a little bit about the effects of Marxism and communism here in the United States. How have the teachings and the writings of Karl Marx basically brought about the collapse of this country?
Well, again, that's a very important question. Karl Marx came up with 10 tenets of communism. I suppose we could say the 10 commandments of communism. And I show in my book that these have taken hold, all of them, in the United States. The top of the list was that he expected that we would have to have a central bank. Well, the central bank was operational in England, and we tried it in America a couple of times, and it just never worked. It always fell short. But he was able to get a central bank in place. It's called the Federal Reserve. And in 1913, these six very wealthy bankers met by, they were going on a duck hunt at Jekyll Island. And they got together and they foisted this central bank, which they called the Federal Reserve to hide the fact that it's a central bank. They foisted this on America, and it was pushed through by Woodrow Wilson and a progressive kind of attitude at that time. And so that's what we're saddled with today. And it's very, very powerful, and it controls an awful lot of what goes on in our country. The next thing was that he insisted on federal control of education. Now that's unconstitutional. The founders were very opposed to anything like that because they had come from England. They had fled England because of the bank, or rather the Church of England, and they didn't want to have that replicated in the United States. So they were very keen about having this kind of general control of education. Our founders were very proud of the education even back then in our country. John Adams bragged about the fact that an illiterate person was as rare, he said, as a earthquake or a lightning strike. And he said we were all philosophers and scientists, and he was bragging. He said that people who came from Europe were astounded to see the level of education among the common people here. That was something that was essential for our founding fathers. They said that a government like the one they established, where people govern themselves, could not function without a moral and well-educated citizenship. Well, this is of course been terribly corrupted in our country. There are a lot of books out now talking about how this has dumbed us down in America for the purpose of creating slaves. I can get into this more if you want. I don't want to take all of our time up on this one subject, although it's very important.
Well, you do in your book seem to have a bone to pick with the public education system. And, of course, the public education system was also one of the 10 planks, as you had mentioned in Karl Marx's manifesto. So, go ahead and take a few minutes because we have them. If you want to go ahead and pick apart the public education system here on our program.
Well, that would be good, but then I don't want to give short shrift to the other planks of Marx's 10 tenets that I think are also poisoning America. There are two very wealthy oligarchs back 100 some years ago, John Rockefeller, the oil guy, and Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, whatever, backed a person who was a communist, John Dewey, Dr. John Dewey, who taught at Columbia University. And John Dewey deliberately turned education on its head. Education for him had nothing to do with learning. It had to do with shaping up the students. In fact, here's a quote of his. He said, children who can think for themselves spoil the harmony of the communal society that is coming, where everyone is interdependent. And he actually got that idea from Prussia, where they wanted to have men who were unable to think for themselves to be robotic soldiers who would follow orders blindly and would not question their leaders. And so he carried this over into America. And even in 1914, the Federal Education Board, which, or no, rather, that's not true. The National Education Association, rather, in 1914, recognized what was going on, and they attacked Carnegie and Rockefeller and exposed the fact that they were destroying democracy by the way they were dumbing down our citizens. They recognized it back in 1914, but nobody listened to them. This has Carnegie and Rockefeller established the Federal Education Board. That's what my first mistake was, the Federal Education Board, and that morphed into the our Federal Department of Education, which is totally illegal. But this is controlled education. There's a Carnegie Institute also, which is a think tank, and it still is in existence, and it still provides the philosophy of education to the public education system, and this goes from kindergarten up to the universities. And it's a Marxist-oriented protocol, and this has gone on for over 100 years, and we haven't put a stop to it. There are some wonderful teachers, and I have to add that there are some wonderful teachers who are trying their best to educate kids, but the overall philosophy is a Marxist philosophy, and they're teaching sexual promiscuity to erode our Christian values. And they're teaching kids that they cannot protect themselves. If someone is bullying someone else and that person tries to defend himself, both are considered to be equally guilty. No, the victim is supposed to run to the principal and say, principal, help me. And this is so different from what our founding fathers expected, where we have a right to look out for ourselves. So all these things are corroding our education. You know, Vladimir Lenin said, "Give me 4 years with children, and the seed I have planted will never be uprooted." And they have 12 years or more with our kids, and look what's happened. The Generation Z and the other young kids are going socialist. Why would they go socialist? Because they're taught socialism. And this has happened in our country, in our watch, and we have to do something about it.
Well, we're going to break here for a commercial, Dr. Mike, and then we'll be back here in just a second. We'll go on with this subject of Christian values.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
All right, we're back with our guest, Dr. Edward Mike, author of the book Salvaging Civilization, available at www.barnesreview.org. Dr. Mike, you had talked about the education system undermining Christian values. And in your book, you talk about a lot about Christian values, and you didn't necessarily say this in your book, but I'm just going to insert it here because you had mentioned a moment ago before the break, you had mentioned President Adams, the second president of the United States, and he had once said that the Constitution and the government of the United States was designed to govern a Christian people and would be totally inadequate to govern anyone else. And so, talking about Christian values, in your book, yes, you say that the way to salvage civilization is to unite America and, shall we even say, Europe and the Western world. with Christian values. Can you provide us with just a general idea of what you have in mind when you make that statement?
Yes, and first of all, I have to show how we can unite, because Christians are a vanishing breed in the United States. The oldest generation, the oldest people, are statistically 85% identified as Christian. But as we go down the age groups, we find that many times the churches are empty and very few people identify as Christian anymore. And consequently, we don't have a Christian influence in our country commensurate with what we need if we're going to unite together to salvage our civilization. And so we have to join with everyone else. A lot of people today say that they're atheists, and a lot of people are what are called nones, N-O-N-E-S, meaning that they don't really have any identification. We have to unite all of us. Research shows that recent research, interesting, very well done research shows that atheists and Christians are alike in almost every way. We all have as our highest priorities freedom and families. Both atheists and Christians have loving families. Christians and atheists want to be productive. They're given to hard work. Christians are generous with Christian projects, but atheists are equally generous with many different goals. And Christians and atheists are both trying to be good people. In fact, the research showed that secular societies were better at looking out for their vulnerable people than the religious societies. So this business of Christians and atheists hating each other has to come to an end, because we've all got to join together if we're going to bring Christian values back into make them the norm in our society. So what do I mean by Christian values? What I did, I took this New Testament, basically, and I arranged it according to different themes to show what I mean by Christian values. And these are universal values. They are values that identify what it's really like to be a functional human being. Jesus taught us these values, but now they're universal, and our country is totally rooted in these values. And as you pointed out so well, we need to have these values if we're going to have a constitutional republic and not fall into communism. So what are these values? Well, of course, first and foremost is love of neighbor, love of others as ourselves, being our brother's keeper. And this means not just talking the talk about love, but walking the walk about love. I like to break down the word responsibility into two words, response and ability, meaning that we need to be able to look out for each other and to have the ability to do that. And this is the mission, the message of Christianity, that we love each other, and everything else has to be secondary to that. And then we have to all embrace each other. This is a message in Scripture, in the good news. Nothing is unclean. And so rather than this diversity politics, this identity politics that's tearing us apart, divide and conquer, that's the opposite of Christian values. Instead, we must unite with each other and respect each other, anyone of goodwill. A good tree bears good fruit, and if we find good fruit, we know the tree has to be good. And then,
so
on
you
the other
had
hand,
mentioned...
we want to avoid... Pardon me?
Oh, I'll say, go ahead.
Oh, we have to avoid corrupting relationships, because they're likely to deter us from our Christian values. We want to take personal responsibility for ourselves. Christianity is the ism of individualism. Communism is the ism of communalism. We have respect for each other as individuals. We're all created equal. Communism says, no, we're just a herd of cows and a flock of chickens. We don't have any rights, any inalienable rights. Christianity says, yes, we do. We're all children of God, and we all have individual rights. And we all have to take responsibility for our lives, therefore. We can't put that off on somebody else. And we have to be persistent. We can't give up. And we have to use common sense. Jesus said, the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And we have to be single-minded. We can't be two-faced. We have to be unpretentious. You know, those who would be in our government, which are simply fellow citizens who we allow to direct society to look out for us, they should be our servants and not lord it over us or take control over us. They are to do our bidding because they are servants, and that's so essential to the Christian message. Going along with that, we can't worship the false god of wealth. And this is another very strong message in the good news. We can't let those who are wealthy have undue influence over the rest of us. We have to respect everyone as equal. Look what's happening today in our country, where these powerful oligarchs, very, very wealthy oligarchs, are taking more and more control over all of the people of our country. How true it is that only a Christian people are fit for this kind of a government. On the other hand, civil obedience is part of the good news when it is justified. When these people are operating according to the consent of the governed, then of course we obey them. We're not anarchists. We don't riot. And we have to be honest and reliable. We have to stand up for justice, and we have to be loyal to each other and faithful to duty, and we have to show care for all living things. So that, in a nutshell, is what I mean by Christian values. And we have to, all of us, join together, because these are universal values. They are part of our nature as human beings. If we are going to be functional, then we have to function according to these values. Otherwise, we're dysfunctional, and we end up with a religion of hate instead of a religion of love.
Well, you had said that the secular state does a better job of being peaceful than the religious state. And so are you saying then that atheists just need to admit that the values that they have when they are good and moral people are Christian values? Or, I mean, because, in other words, why unite under religious values if secular people are doing a better job of governing themselves than the religious people?
Well, again, the foundation for everything is the laws of nature and of nature's God. This is what the beautiful phrase that Thomas Jefferson came up with: the laws of nature and of nature's God. These are universal laws. They apply to every human being because we all have the same essence. We're all created equal. And so if we want to call them Christian values or we want to call them atheistic values, I don't care. They're the same values. But what I show in my book is that if we take a look at when Scripture was written many, many, many years ago, and we understand, again, the context of what was going on back then, we can take those same values and modernize them and show that a lot of the attacks on Christianity by atheists are justified. They're attacks on a corrupt religion business, as I certainly discovered in the Vatican years ago. They're attacks on a misunderstanding of Scripture because we don't understand it in the context of the time when it was written. And when we clarify these differences, we find that atheists and Christians can understand each other and respect each other, and therefore practice the same. We do practice the same values, and unite with these values. These are the basis for our uniting. And as you pointed out so well, our society can't survive without these Christian values. Whether you call them Christian values or atheist values, I don't care. They're the same values because they're the values of the laws of nature and of nature's God, and they're universal and they apply forever.
I believe it was even Romans chapter 1, the Apostle Paul said something to the effect that even if there were no scripture, that nature itself would teach the law of God to men.
Yes, and I use an analogy there. I say, look, I and my wife are going to take a trip. We're going to go from Hartford to Phoenix. And in my van, I've got a compass, and it tells me that I have to go south-southwest to get to Phoenix. So that's right inside the vehicle itself. But I would never start on that trip without going to AAA or MapQuest and getting maps and probably buying maps of the different states that I'm going to travel through, because I don't want to make a false move. I want to be able to do it right the first time. And that's what Scripture is. It's just something that helps us to stay on track. And I say, I don't want to get in an argument with my brother-in-law and sister-in-law who are traveling with us about the right way to go. And these are the guidelines that keep us all united. And so that's where I'm coming from. Yes, we are not defective. God don't make junk. We are not defective. We are a functional entity. Occasionally when genes replicate themselves, they don't get a good copy. And so eventually, sooner or later, we're going to have some defective specimens. But that doesn't mean that our nature is defective. If it were, we wouldn't exist. It's kind of the survival of the fit, If we were totally unfit as an essence, as a nature, we wouldn't be around. And so we have to respect the fact that we're all functional human beings. We just need guidance. We just need to know how to function functionally. And that's what Jesus has taught us. He's the Lord of the living. He's living in those people who try to practice these values that he introduced us to. This is the beginning of civilization. And our civilization still rests on these values, and there's no other way around it. We either keep these values or we lose civilization.
Well, I'm going to ask you one final question, and it's this. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, are they the beginning of the salvaging of civilization, or are they just one more reason why civilization needs to be salvaged?
Well, I suppose everyone's got their own opinion, but I think that any thinking human being today has to recognize that we are in a terrible crisis in our country and actually around the world. Our Christian values have been thrown in the garbage heap. And if anyone has any question about it, these first weeks now of the Biden administration should answer that question very, very clearly. Biden is acting like a king. He's issuing all of these executive orders, which are totally beyond his role as the first of three different branches of government. But he seems to think that he's immune from any of the constraints of the Constitution. And he's tearing down everything that we have been trying to build up for the last 4 years.
On that note, we are going to close out today's TBR Radio Presents the TBR History Hour. But tune into our next show, TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show, because Dr. Mike was there in the Capitol on January 6th during the alleged insurrection, and he will tell you the story. On TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show, www.barnesreview.org. Check out Dr. Mike's book, Salvaging Civilization. and pick up a copy of the January-February 2021 issue of TBR Magazine. We'll be back again, same time, same place next week. Until then, from all of us here at TBR Radio, God bless. Talk to you again next week.